I'm Amber McCrae, a nutritional therapist. I help women become more in tune with their mind, body, and soul through holistic nutrition and emotionally focused therapy. I help them create a more meaningful, energetic, and connecting life.
Welcome back, Michelle. Thank you for joining us again. And we're just going to pick up right where we left off.
I want to thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to tell my story.
So, you were talking about your children and, the effect that you saw. What was really the turning point? Was there an incident that happened for you that was like, okay, I got to change something?
Absolutely. So, I started recognizing things about myself, and I lived in a world filled with impossible for a very long time. I had little to no sense of self-worth. Any mistake that I would make played on repeat in my head, and I have this, inner critic that just rages so loudly. And anytime my kids would make a mistake, that would just embolden that inner critic of mine. But I was so good at masking that my husband had no idea how much I hated myself. But my kids knew. My kids would hear that inner critic of mine loud and clear when it would snap at them for the smallest of things, or when they would hear me berate myself for forgetting something, or when my actions would make them responsible for regulating my emotions. And my relationship with my daughters was very rocky, especially the relationship with my second daughter. It had gotten so bad that I made the decision to send her away for 6 months because I knew that some major changes needed to take place. And I was on the verge of hating her. And I was so terrified of hating my child. Both of my daughters were self-harming in their own ways, and they were acting out at home and at school, stealing from their friends, stealing from us. We were just really struggling. And so one day I walked into my daughter's room to put away her laundry, and I noticed that she had written these messages to herself on post-it notes. She had these post-it notes that were covering her mirror. And I went closer to read them thinking, oh, that's sweet. She wrote herself love notes or something, but she did not write herself love notes at all. The messages that she had written to herself said horrible things like, no one will ever love you. You have no friends because you're ugly. You're stupid and everyone hates you. Like, I was just mortified. I couldn't believe what I was reading because I had said some really harsh things to my daughters when I was angry, but I never said anything like that to them. But the interesting thing was all of those phrases that she had written to herself were things that I would tell myself regularly. I would say these things to myself in my head all of the time. And so I took the Sharpie that was sitting on her dresser and I wrote lie in all caps across every single one of them. And I went to my bathroom. I was just, crying, my face red and puffy. I looked at myself in the mirror and I was just trying to figure out like how did she get this message? How did she get these messages? How did they hear these things when I didn't say it out loud? And so I realized that even though I hadn't been saying these things directly to my daughters, they had picked it up because they were watching my actions towards myself. The way I treated myself was teaching them how to treat themselves. I didn't like what I saw in the mirror. I didn't like who I was becoming. And so I thought about them and I thought about my other daughter who I had sent away. And I realized that the reason that she had been struggling and the reason she had been being a bully to kids at school was because I was being a bully to her at home. I realized that the problems my girls were facing in life had been exacerbated by a mother who was unwilling to sit with them in their struggles, a mother ignorant of their cries for help, a mother too caught up in hating her own reflection that she didn't see she was feeling her own children's self-hatred. And so I realized that the problem was me, like the problem with the relationship I had with my daughters, it was me. And so the only logical thing that I could think of to do was to change myself.
Man, Michelle, that's some huge stuff.
It
And
was a lot. It
again,
was a lot. Very emotional. Lots of face on the floor, crying. Lots of it.
yeah, and I think, as a mother, I can relate and thank you for just being so vulnerable and sharing some of those really raw feelings. I think that, like you had mentioned, those things that we don't talk about, and I kind of like to call them the taboo topics, right? Is that the way that sometimes we feel about our kids, you had mentioned that this hatred was starting to grow.
It
And
was.
I think that that's something, again, that we don't talk about very often as parents because other people, what we're supposed to feel, right? Or what other people are going to say. But these feelings are real. And I would say so many parents feel the same way and are struggling and feel alone and that shame and guilt of how can I feel this about my child? And you being able to openly share that is just a reminder that we're not alone, that these feelings are natural and are an indicator that, hey, something's going on. We need to change something up.
Right. Something needs our attention. Absolutely. And most of the time, what I have found in my own, healing process is most of the time for me, the thing that needs to change, the thing that needs attention is myself. Because that's what I
Yeah,
have the power, that's what I have the power to change, Like I can't control the people around me, but I can control myself.
right. And you had mentioned, you had said a super powerful, just gut-wrenching statement of because you realized that her mother was her first bully.
Oh, I
And
was.
and
Hmm.
that again takes so much courage and just vulnerability to be able to admit that we were our kids' first bullies and the that we're actually taught to be that way.
Hmm.
I was just having a conversation um, about this that the the words of we're supposed to prepare them for the real world. Well, how will they know? How will they be prepared if we don't teach them? And that mentality of that our job is to hurt them first so they know what it's like to be hurt is so crazy.
It is. It is crazy. And I don't think that our job is to like yes, our job is to prepare them for the real world. But that doesn't mean that you have to be unnecessarily harsh. It doesn't mean that, you berate them. It doesn't mean that you make them feel like something is wrong with them because, it's not that something is wrong with them, it's something is wrong with the strategy. And so I think in order to be able to be firm with your kids, it's important to be firm with them. But you can be firm in a loving way and in a firm way, but you have to have that baseline of connection. Like they
Mm,
have to know that, this is coming from a place of love, not a place of judgment.
right. And it has to make sense, like make it make
Mm-hmm.
sense, right? Like we were told when we were getting spanked, I don't know if you experienced this, but I'm doing this because I
I
love
love
you and this
you.
hurts me more than it hurts you. And
Yeah,
that logic just doesn't compute. It doesn't make
it
sense.
doesn't. It doesn't make sense. I hated the this hurts me more than it hurts you. Or what I got was, when it hurts too much to sit down tomorrow, remember I did this because I love you. Because all that does is
Right.
teaches you that love is pain. And
Yes.
thinking that, and yes, like there is pain in love, but not that kind of pain. Not pain that, is intentionally inflicted upon someone because you want to control them. That's completely
Right.
different.
Right. And I don't know if you feel the same way, but something I really learned because I also came from a very religious background and I went through all of these therapies and learning. I truly believe that my job as a parent is not really to protect my children. And I know that that sounds absolutely insane to most people. It is our job to hold boundaries, right? Teach them, hey, don't run into the street. because there are cars and you can get hit. But I cannot protect them from everything or hardly really anything
Right.
in that instance, especially when they get older. And the more that I held so tight to try to protect, the more they just tried to break out of that anyway. And so, really, I would have screaming battles with God at that point. I was like, I don't understand why you made me a parent. I can't protect her from all these bad things happening, no matter what I did. And at that point, I heard, your job is not to protect, your job is to love her and be there for her. This
Yeah.
kind of circles back to something we were talking about earlier is that in trauma, most of the time, it is not the trauma that is what people have a hard time healing from. It's the lack of a connection, lack of attachment, of having a safe place to process and be okay in feeling what happened to them.
Right. It's not necessarily the event that's happening.
Right.
It's what should have happened in those moments,
Right.
the moments whenever you were feeling completely abandoned, that you didn't have someone come along and say, "Hey, I'm here with you," or hold your hand, or help you, or give you words to
Right.
the emotions that you were feeling. One of the books I read was called The Conscious Parent, and in that book, the author said that behavior is language when you don't have the words to say. And
Oh,
so
that's beautiful.
right. And so the first time I'd ever heard anything like that. And so whenever my kids, especially, were acting out and throwing their own tantrums, whatever age they were, because I mean, even now, my three oldest are young adults, like they still have, their tantrums and things like that. But I feel like my job as their mom in those moments is to help give them the words,
Yeah.
help them find the words, or just sitting with them, when they're in the
Right.
middle of it. I'll ask them now, what can I do for you in this moment? And then they
So
tell me, and
powerful.
that's what I do.
Right.
But yeah, yeah,
That's so huge. And that goes back to being their safe place and just being with them. And we have talked so much about love and that unconditional love. And that I feel is really our job as parents is how to give unconditional love. And I think so much we get caught up in the protection and saving them from bad things happening to them, and then being fully crushed when we
right,
can't do that. And
right.
that is something that we cannot do no matter how hard we
No,
try.
especially when they're grown and they go out in the world, and
Right.
yeah, it's the most horrible feeling for your child to go through something that you weren't able to protect them from. But yeah, that
And you
safe
need a safe place in that moment
oh
to be able
God,
to
do
not be
you?
okay.
Oh my gosh, isn't that true? That's the great thing about having social media, I think, is that it
Mm,
creates that sense of community for people.
yes.
I love that that's what TikTok has done, is having that algorithm that really brings like-minded people together. Because I think it's good to have that space. Well, I also think it's good to look at opposing sides and things like that, because I'm
Right.
just weird and I want to know all about everything.
I love it.
But
Again, this is why I was drawn to you. There's so much.
but but yeah, like being that safe space for them, providing that place of safety for them, because that's foundational for them as they go throughout the rest of their life.
Yeah, and you know that it brings me to when I was transitioning per se into my new parenting style. I literally changed my life, everything that I did, right? And I remember family and friends having such a hard time and not being able to understand. And
Hmm.
I have an almost 11-year-old, and he just likes to do what he wants. He likes to dress how he wants and be comfortable. And before I was programmed, you have to dress a certain way. We don't go out like that. Like all of these things. And a family member said to me, because he was wearing like his shirt inside out, his pocket, his shorts were inside out and pockets hanging out. And they were like, you need to teach him how to fix that, or otherwise he's going to be made fun of. And I remember thinking, first there's that initial fear because it's
Mm-hmm.
just so innately ingrained in there. And then I was like, it goes back to being our child's first bully. And I was like, you know what? No, I want to give him confidence in what he chooses. That's
Right.
what's going to teach him to face the world, not to tell
Yeah.
him, yes, what you're doing is wrong. That begins to instill that negative critic
It
and
is.
not listen to yourself.
You're perpetuating and creating that inner critic that, we as adults who have been gaslighted our whole entire life, we know what that critic sounds like. We hear it, daily. And so to think that as parents we could somewhat prevent that just by being kind, just by allowing them to be authentic, just by, honestly, in cases like that, I was always big on who I wanted to allow to have access to my kids. Like, me and
Hmm.
my husband had to make some really difficult decisions with grandparents. And my husband has been no contact with his mom for 9 years. I've been no contact with my parents for 3 years. And it's a horrible decision to have to make because you want that connection with your parents.
Right.
You want, to have a relationship with them, but I could see that, you know, that was not the best influence that I wanted to have around my kids. And so we made that decision to not allow them to have that access, at least while they're under our roof. When they turn 18, they
Yeah.
can make whatever decision they want. But I do think as parents, it is important to take a look at what influences we are allowing whenever it's sort of within our control. You know, um,
Right.
that was
And I think,
another,
yeah, that was again one of the things that really drew me to you is because we are hearing and seeing, I don't know if it's true for you, these generations, our generation and generations before us, do not have connections with their adult children and are very confused on why
why. Hmm.
and why they can't see their grandkids.
Hmm.
And not really being able to understand. And I see time and time, I see both sides. A lot of, people, well, why are my adult kids doing this, keeping me from my kids and my grandkids? And then just the other side of, hey, you're not hearing me. And you were talking about gaslighting. And for me, gaslighting really just means invalidating our feelings and turning
Yeah.
it back around and making it about them. And
Yes.
I think so many generations before us do not really know. And it is hard for me still, in some connections to really validate and not make it about us because we get so defensive.
Right, right. And that was one of the big things when I went back to my kids when I recognized the things that I knew I had gotten wrong. I was like, you know what? I need to go to them and I need to tell them that I'm sorry. I need to, atone for what I got wrong. And so when I went to them to tell them, hey, this is what I know that I've done. I'm so sorry. I want you to forgive me. You don't have to. That choice is yours. But what else is there that I didn't see? Like what do you have to add to this? Like what have I done to you that you wanted to tell me but you haven't? And initially they were very reluctant. Like they were just like, "Oh, mom, you didn't know. Like it's okay." But then as they sat with it, they got very angry. And rightfully so. I was honestly happy that they got angry because they needed to. They needed to
Yeah.
be able to process it. And so in that moment when they came at me, basically, I I didn't tell them, "Oh, well, it's because, I have four of you guys and four kids is overwhelming. Oh, it's because I had to learn how to be my own parent and that's why I didn't know how to parent you." Like I could have given all these excuses, but I didn't want them to think that I wasn't hearing them. I didn't want to make it about me because in that
Hmm.
moment it wasn't. It's not about me. It's about them. And so I think just like you said, making sure that we're not turning it around and making it about us and, giving them these reasons or excuses or whatever. Because if I would have done that in those moments, it would have continued the invalidation
Yes.
that they had been receiving all along. And mom really didn't change, is what that would have told them.
Yeah, that mom is still unsafe.
Mom is still unsafe, absolutely. And I didn't want it to be that way. And so I don't know how I knew that that's the way it needed to go. Like I said, I read a ton of things, but that was just the way I handled it.
And Michelle, again, you're just such a rock star because again, I don't it's stuff that I've experienced and learned how to do, but it's not I don't see many people doing it. And so when I came across your page and you were just I think that was the first TikTok I saw where you had posted about going to your kids and giving them that opportunity
Be
to be
angry.
upset. Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's not talked about and is not done by many people as far as I've seen and heard. And it's such hard work.
Well, because it's so scary is the
It
thing.
is
It's
so
just like
scary.
because, you know, when I was trying to convince myself to do it, I thought to myself like, what if they never forgive me?
Right.
What if they never forgive me? And well, then that it is what it is because their anger and their reason for not wanting to forgive me is completely valid. They have every reason in the world to feel the way that they feel towards me because I did verbally abuse them. I did physically abuse them. I did make them feel small, and I did invalidate them, you know several times. And honestly, again, with trauma, we can go back and it's not necessarily what happened, but what didn't happen. So they
Right.
didn't have a mother who was willing to sit with them in their struggle. They didn't have a mother who was emotionally regulated. I just wasn't what they needed. And as a parent, that's our job. Our job is to be what they need in those various stages. And yes, I didn't know. I didn't know. And you can't do what you don't know. However, my whole thought is at the end of the day, the black and white of it is I'm the mom. I should have known. And because I didn't, now that I do know, it's my job to go back and say, hey, I messed up and I'm
Right.
so sorry.
Right. And that's such a huge I mean, we could talk hours about this topic,
I know, yeah, we could.
But I think that there's such where this duality, right? And I think we live in such a world where one has to be right and one has to be wrong. And what
Mm-hmm.
I learned is that we can both be right in those moments. I had to sit with my daughter and I remember sitting on the side of the bathtub and you know, we went through a horrible divorce, her father and I, and it was just very taxing for her and very traumatizing. And I ended up leaving the home. And so while I had many reasons that I needed to do that, for her, her mom still left. And
Yes.
I was
Mm-hmm.
not there for her. And one of the things was that she remembers, having to make her own cereal and breakfast and feeling like my mom is not here for me.
Mm-hmm.
And until I could just validate how scary and crappy that was, and that I did abandon her in those moments that
Mm-hmm.
she needed
Yes.
without defending why I did it. And that's
Yes.
I can still I can still have made the right choice for what I felt like I needed to do in those moments and still not be there for her. There's
Mm-hmm.
this
Absolutely.
duality that I think that is really hard for people to wrap their head around.
Right. And again, it goes back to it's not necessarily like what did happen, it's what didn't happen because in those moments
Right.
you weren't there. And she was a child. She couldn't understand that mom wasn't here because she has to go
Right.
to work because the electricity needs to be paid. This is why we have cereal. This is why, they're just too young to understand
Right.
those things. And so again, like if we try to, reason and say, "Oh, well, this is why," it's still invalidating because we're still not seeing them. It's still putting the spotlight on us. And in those moments, it's not about us. It's about them and it's about what they need. And this is our opportunity to meet that need in that moment because, those pieces of us that, the inner child and inner teenager, all those pieces of us that still need to be healed, they show up. Like, so even with my
Oh,
own
yes.
kids, they show up from time to time,
Yeah.
and it's kind of like the universe giving us a redo opportunity, and you
Yes.
just have to be present, in order to pick up on that. So then you can get it right the second time at least.
Yeah. And I think that even as adults, we still need this,
We do, we
And
do.
I've experienced this not too long ago with somebody that I need that from. And I expressed what, my parent and I expressed what I had felt. And the response was, if you knew how much I love you and I sacrificed, you wouldn't be mad at me for what I did. You would
Hmm.
understand. And I think that that's the overall energy that so many parents have is if you only knew what I went through, if you only knew how much I really love you, you couldn't be hurt. And that's just not the way it works.
It doesn't. And I think in those moments is where that's where, self love and being your own loving parent, that's when I think that comes into play because yes, I need that validation, right? All of us need validation, but it is not our child's job to
Yes,
provide us with that. That is not their job. And so in those instances, we need to get that validation from ourselves sometimes,
hmm,
or go to a spouse or whatever. But in those
yes,
situations where you don't have that connection and that relationship with the parent or the other person to where they can give you that validation, then that's when you just have to give it to yourself.
right. And I think that that's so huge in recognizing that. And that's where I love the science behind all of it, is that it helps us understand that these are natural things that occur in us. Um, and with our emotions and being able to regulate and what happens. And you had mentioned earlier, when we make our children responsible for our emotions, that is such a heavy burden for anybody, but let alone a small child to carry.
Absolutely. Well, because
And
then they
we do that by saying when we get mad at them for being too loud because
right.
we can't handle it. And that's kind of, you know,
Yes.
putting our making our children responsible for how we're feeling.
Exactly, and I think that that blurs the line for the child, and so they cannot really see who they are outside of just your child.
Right.
It's just
Yeah.
it really messes with their ability to be authentic with themselves because now my job is to nurture my parent. My job is to make sure that they feel loved and they feel safe and they feel secure. And so it blurs that line. So now you have a parentified, however you say that word, child. Um, and yeah, it's a slippery
Exactly.
slope. It's a
It
slippery
really
slope.
is. And this is why we're talking about it, right?
Yeah.
So that's all the time we have for today. Please join us for the next episode to hear more of Michelle's story.
Thank you so much for listening, Amber. I just really appreciate all of this.